I'm Rebecca Goldberg, Executive Director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Science and Israel Studies, and I'm happy to welcome you tonight to this special program. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this program with Israeli scholar, Israeli author and memoirist Ayelet Tsabari and Israel Institute visiting Professor Yael Segalovitz. They'll be speaking about Ayelet Tsabari's debut novel, Songs for the Brokenhearted. When I first read debut novel, by the way, I was like, wait, but you've written all these books before, so I had to stop and sort of think about it. But debut novel it is. This is our second opportunity this semester and just this month to host a prominent Israeli author and novelist in conversation with Professor Segalovitz. It's really a pleasure to have a comparative literature scholar in residence at the Helen Diller Institute this year to facilitate these conversations, and I hope and expect that there will be more in the spring as well. These are a few examples of the ways the Helen Diller Institute provides a rich academic forum for our students and faculty to explore the breadth and complexity of Israel and contemporary Jewish issues. At a time on campus and elsewhere where polarization is more severe than ever, the Helen Diller Institute works to foster dynamic spaces where Berkeley students can engage meaningfully and constructively on big issues of the day, in all their complexity, however challenging or contested. So as examples, next week we will host Mohammed Darasha, scholar and practitioner of Shared Society Initiatives, in conversation with Koret visiting Professor Masua Sagiv. We'll also have two more webinars this semester, one with anthropologist Karen Friedman-Peleg, and the other with author and journalist Nadav Eyal. And later in November, we will host historian and leading Israel Studies scholar Ilan Troen. You'll find more information about these talks in the flyers at the back of the room and on our website. We've also launched this semester UC Berkeley's Israel Studies minor, building on the dozens of courses we offer each year. And we engage a cohort of 30 undergrad fellows in leadership training and in program planning for their peers, including how to have difficult conversations and how to engage across differences. All of these programs, activities, and events are dependent on philanthropic support from the community, so we thank you for that. And now I can introduce our speakers. First, our moderator, Yael Segalovitz, who is the 2024-2025 Israel Institute Visiting Professor at the Helen Diller Institute. While at UC Berkeley, she is teaching courses in Hebrew literature and translation in the Department of Comparative Literature and Jewish Studies. She's also an assistant professor in the Department of Foreign Literatures and Linguistics at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. She received her PhD here from the Department of Comparative Literature at UC Berkeley, and she was a Townsend Center Fellow and a Cawthon Fellow. And her research spans American Hebrew and Brazilian modernisms with a focus on transnational literary exchanges, complemented by her work translating literary works across these cultural contexts. In her forthcoming book, How Close Reading Made Us, The Transnational Legacies of New Criticism, follows the global circulation of close reading beyond the Anglophian orbit and the praxis impact on modernist literary production. And I believe that we're working on a program relating to your rolling out your book, or a book launch, maybe we can call it. Her current project follows the resurgence of psychoanalytic object relations theory within the American humanities, leading to the emergence of a new hybrid literary genre she terms psychoanalyterature. Did I say that right? That's not so easy. Okay, and now I get to introduce Ayelet Tsabari, who was born in Israel to a large family of Yemeni descent, which comes out very much in your writings. She's the author of The Art of Leaving, winner of the Canadian Jewish Literary Award for Memoir, finalist for the Writers' Trust Hilary Weston Prize, and an Apple Books and Kirkus Review Best Book of 2019. Her first book, The Best Place on Earth, won the Sami Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature and the Edward Louis Walland Award, and was longlisted for the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award. The book was a New York Times Book Review's Editor's Choice, a Kirkus Review Best Book of 2016, and has been published internationally. She's also the co-editor of the anthology Tongues, on longing and belonging through language. Her book, Songs for the Brokenhearted, the focus of tonight's conversation, has just been released from HarperCollins Random House. And in the back, we have a QR code for anybody who wants to purchase the book. And now I welcome you to the program. Thank you so much for both being here.
Ayelet, it is such a pleasure to have you here as an avid reader of your work. I'm really, truly excited to have the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you.
In such a forum. And let me start with a serious comment. If you haven't seen Ayelet's nails, you should. She has the cover art of the book on her nails, and this is the height of the evening. So go and watch it. Now to more serious topics.
Yeah. Nails are serious, but
nails are serious, absolutely. We are in very difficult times, to say the least. And you are a woman of words. So if you can tell us what it feels like. Do you have words for the moment? And maybe more specifically, when did you start writing the book, and how did October 7th hit you? Before, after, in between?
Yeah. I started writing the book years ago. It's a book that took a long time to write and research. The day on October 7th, I actually woke up at 6 in the morning because I had a deadline for the novel. It was like the final deadline, like the last iteration. You know, I just had to send the edits, and so yeah, I was up actually, but kind of like still partially asleep. And then a few days later, my editors were like, "Just don't worry about it. Send us what you've done so far, and when you get to it, when you get to finish, we'll deal with it later." So that's what happened. And then when they finally, when I read the whole thing again, it was like reading almost. It wasn't that I was reading a new book. I was reading with new eyes. There was so much that changed, even in my reading of my own words, you know, and so many concerns. I'm being completely frank here, but like concerns were like, wait a second, am I being too critical here, or is this too biased the way that I said this? And suddenly everything just got so confused in my head, and I had to consult with other people to kind of tell me, you know, like don't mess with it, you know, this is good as it is, don't make too many changes at this point. And that's what I ended up doing. As far as words in general, I think the first request to write something about the October 7 came on October 8. And I remember feeling almost angry at the request. It's like, what? No, I no. And then again, my friends, my family were like, no, we need this. We need your words. This is important. And the way that I ended up writing about 3 pieces that were published one in October. One was published October 11th in Canada's Globe and Mail. The second one was published in November, I think, in Tablet. And the third one maybe in December in a literary magazine called The New Quarterly. They're all available online. At first I literally had no words. I sat there in front of the computer and I was like, I really can't say or articulate anything meaningful or important or useful to anyone. But then I remembered teaching a module once about writing about trauma and writing about grief. And I dug out the handout that I created and I read it. And that's how I found my way into those pieces. I decided to write in a fragmented way because there was nothing linear or, coherent in the, or transitionary. I just allowed myself to write blocks of text and have some white spaces kind of in between each. And I reminded myself that it's okay to be okay with questions and not to be writing, not to be putting on the burden of providing answers or insights, but just be comfortable with the questions. And these were the two things that I found helped me find some words. I don't know how good they were, but they were words. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just going to quiet my own phone.
I can tell you as a reader that what struck me was the time period in which you're locating one of the story's narratives. So for those of you who haven't read the whole book or are enjoying through it, it is placed one narrative in the 1950s and then the other in 1995. And the Oslo Accords and Rabin's assassination is a very central narrative. And it seemed in Israeli history that the Oslo Accords are something that we have left behind as a history, and now, in the current moment, every conversation is about Oslo. So I was just wondering what brought you in a kind of hindsight to be able to recognize the wound, or I don't know, the festering wound of the Oslo Accords, and to place the narrative there.
I was 20-something when Oslo happened, when the assassination happened. And I often think that in my memoir, I talk sometimes about that fork in the road that led me to immigrate, to leave, to move Israel. And I say it's my father's death as a child. But I think of Rabin's assassination as another fork in the road. And obviously for Israel, for the conflict, but also for me personally. I sometimes wonder if that was another spot that could have maybe kept me in Israel. That hopefulness of Oslo and that absolute despair that followed, I really do think that it made a huge impact on my eventual choice to leave. And that's why, for me, I sometimes think about, I compare the two, the assassination of Rabin felt like one of those times where you really see history happening. And October 7 was another moment like that for me. But yeah, it was my own preoccupation with that moment in time and how it affected me, personally, because I think writers and people are self-centered, and this is generally where we come from. So that's what it was, trying to kind of going back and spending time in that moment. And also I would say that the 90s was just, it was just an important decade for me. So spending time there was something that I enjoyed doing. Yeah.
And in your answer as well, you combine, the personal and the collective.
That's
I
right.
feel like you do it very with such craft in the book as well. It doesn't seem artificial. It seems like
Thank you.
characters really have a life in their current present. And I was wondering, in relation to Oslo and Rabin, and the turmoil of the time and the current time, if you can talk a bit about the character of Yoni. Because what I found striking is that Ayelet really takes us through Yoni's point of view of being pushed into very right extremist political polarity, but you do it with such conviction and strength. So I was wondering, one, if you maybe want to read a little bit of Yoni,
Sure.
But also tell us a little bit about this character.
I don't think, like, for me, writing fiction is not interesting if you're just writing characters that are just like you. I always want to challenge myself. I always want to really try to understand. You know, they talk about reading and reading fiction as an act of empathy. You know, they're talking about novels being like engines of empathy and so on. And I think that there's something about writing fiction that is also promotes empathy. As soon as I thought about it, there was something about the idea that scared me, and that's usually a good sign in writing. You're like, okay, I'm, you know, I hit something hot and I hit something good. I really wanted to understand how, because there were so many. I've seen the videos and I've seen the anger and I've seen the violence in the demonstrations against Rabin, and I wanted to understand. So that's where it came from, you know. And I feel very, I love Yoni, you know. I mean, I love them all, but I really felt for him, and I feel like I could understand him, and that's a triumph for me. You know what I mean? So yeah, that was where the inception of that character came from.
I really want to find this moment.
I know, you should tell me. I love it
Yeah.
when I love it when I'm told what to read, because I always have my, you know, my spots that I read.
You should always come to me. I can tell you what to read.
Please tell me.
Okay. But of course I marked it, and now I can't find exactly the place that I want to go to. But this is a moment in which he actually finds an outlet for his rage in the big demonstration in Zion Square.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
13.
Let's see.
No.
I will find it. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Just give me a book.
Yes. So
Okay.
it's, yeah,
Where?
maybe from this or from that.
Okay. So yeah, that's those of you who've, I keep forgetting that not everyone spent the last few years watching every demonstration against Rabin, but there was a really, really big one in Zion Square in Jerusalem that was considered kind of, it was monumental because things happened in it that no one has ever seen happen before. That's where they were, you know, I'm actually going to read that, so I'm not going to say more, but it was very important for me to dramatize that as much as possible.
Which page?
This is page 214. I'm going to read from this because it's...
Go for it.
Yoni was swept away by the excitement when Benjamin Netanyahu, chairman of the Likud and the leader of the opposition, yelled from the balcony, "Is there anyone in this crowd who believes Yasser Arafat?" When Likud member Ariel Sharon spoke, the crowds went wild. "You can't break the spirit of the Jews," he announced in his booming nasal voice. "These are days of total, shameful surrender by the Prime Minister and his Foreign Minister to the war criminal Arafat." Yoni booed when the crowd booed. He chanted, Rabin is a traitor. He yelled, in blood and fire we'll drive Rabin out, until his throat dried out. The sound of thousands of voices coming together to a single chant, their deafening echo, was infectious, electrifying. Yes, he heard the chant, death to Rabin. Saw the enraged crowds jumping and screaming at the top of their lungs with such glee. Did he join in too? He couldn't remember. He remembered finding it catchy, rhythmically addictive. He saw the stack of papers being passed around with the image of Rabin dressed as an SS officer, and the posters of Rabin with a target on his face, a keffiyeh draped over his head, both his eyes poked out. Saw, somewhere to his right, protesters hurling burning torches at policemen. There were things he barely registered, like the bearded man next to him who lit a match to Rabin's image. And later, when he was pulled into a dance around a fire, arms weaving around other sweaty men he didn't know but who felt to him like brothers. What was being burnt? What were they chanting?
Thank you. The background for Yoni's rage that we can see finds an outlet here is also rooted in histories of exclusion within the Israeli collective of Yemeni communities.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the thread or the way that these two narratives or histories come together.
Yeah. Where do I start?
My job is to ask the question, so you have the difficult part of answering.
Yeah, but there's just so much to say about this, right? One of the threads in the novel is the missing Yemenite, Mizrahi, and Balkan children affair, which happened in the beginning of right after Israel was founded. And of course, during that time, the government was led by Mapai, which later became the Labour Party. So what happened, and I think it's still happening in that sense that the right and the Likud often used this in a cynical way to get Mizrahi voters to, sort of
align themselves.
Yeah, align themselves with the right. There's many other reasons I would say why Mizrahi vote right, but for me, it's definitely there's a cynical use and exploitation of the tragedy, which is really unfortunate because it becomes, as we can see here, it becomes a kind of a left and right sort of battle instead of nobody wants to accept or acknowledge even the tragedy because it's so politically loaded. But yeah, I think for Yoni, who grew up with that kind of loss of his uncle, and in a sense also he's stepping into that role of that missing uncle for his grandmother. Yeah, this is something that shadows his entire existence. But yeah, there's so much more I can say about this. I'm gonna stop now. I don't know. Yeah.
It's okay, we have time, and also that brings me really to the next thing that I wanted to ask you. Again, I found it so courageous that you're touching on all of these volatile subjects. One of them is the missing children's affair. Yeah. So you can say a little bit what brought you to write about it, and also the research and how you found a voice for that.
Wow, yeah. So,
and do people usually know what you're talking about?
Okay, so when I started researching and looking into this affair, which was maybe 15 years ago, it's crazy how much things changed, because back when I started looking into it, nobody knew what I was talking about. Even in Israel, it was so silenced that it was just, people really were like, this is just some Oriental imagination, right? People actually said that. They used those terms. It's like completely dismissed. And then I started looking into it. The first thing that I found out is that my aunt, as a baby, was actually taken out of her, the ma'abara, the transition camp, and her parents were told that she had died. And her father would not accept it, and he toured the hospital looking for her and found her in another room dressed in other clothes. And these are stories that, there's not many stories like that, but there are some stories of people who insisted and fought hard enough and found their children back then, right? And once I had that sort of connection, I really needed to know more. And when I started looking into it, that was before, this is important, I thought this was going to be the focus of my novel. It was before my daughter was born. And I went into archives, in the Zionist archives in Jerusalem, and I can't tell you how many times I was told, oh, we're sorry, this is closed to the public. Once I started looking into things that people didn't want people to look at. And then I had a baby. Seriously, I want to start crying right now. I could no longer write it. I couldn't. I would sit at my desk and I'd start shaking and crying. I'm getting emotional. I couldn't write the story from that point of view anymore. It was just too painful. In my research too, I met a lot of the stories. There's a scene in here where Zohara, the main character, is talking to a bunch of elderly women. And there's a scene where she remembers in her classroom when all the children were talking about, oh, my grandmother lost her baby and so on. These are all true stories. These are all recordings that I've had, and I just put them in the book. I sat with elderly women who cried, and I cried and held their hands. So I shifted. First I had to tell my agents and my editors, I'm sorry, I'm not writing this novel. And then I kind of just shifted the novel a little bit. And I realized that I could still have that affair and that loss in the background, because it's just the way it was for so many Yemeni families, right? Like, this is how it is. It's just something in their background. And sometimes they don't talk about it, as Saida, the grandmother in the story, often didn't speak about it. But it was just that trauma, that communal trauma was a part of our story as a community. It didn't have to be the story, it could just be there. And that was the way that I was able to include it and to honor it. Because I remember talking to a family friend, and when I told him I can't do it anymore, he almost got mad. He said, no, you have to tell this. This is a calling. And I was like, I can't. So yeah, that was kind of my way of reconciling it and still including it without touching it too hotly in a way that would break me.
I have to say that as a reader, for me, this is still the heart of the story, right? So it looms very large, and it haunts the characters. And as we've seen, it also somehow leads Yoni and leads the kind of collective occurrences. I don't know if it's too hard, but do you mind reading for us the story of Raphael's disappearance? We can also, okay.
Yeah.
This is from Zohara's point of view.
My brother Rafael disappeared from the immigrant camp in Rosh Ha'ain a few months after my family landed in Israel in 1949. They told me he was an easygoing, good-natured, and healthy baby. When they arrived in the camp, they were instructed to house all infants in a nursery. It was better for the babies, the nurses had said. The tents were unhygienic. At first, the Yemeni mothers rebelled, sneaking in to steal their own babies back, until the camp tightened security. My mother had gone to the nursery several times a day to nurse Rafael. In the evenings, she would take him out, bathe him, and play with him before bringing him back. One morning, my mother went to the nursery, and Rafael wasn't there. The nurses informed her my brother had developed a cold, so they sent him to the hospital in Tel Aviv overnight. My father was away at the time, working up north. My mother took a bus to visit Rafael, but when she arrived, she was told by a receptionist that Rafael had died. Every time I imagine that moment, my young mother, a teenager really, receiving the news that would alter her life forever, I feel like I can't breathe from the magnitude of inherited grief. My mom collapsed on the floor of the hospital, screaming and crying. Her boy had died, except he was completely healthy and vital the day before. Except they wouldn't give her a death certificate or show her a body or a grave. "You're still young," a nurse told her. "You'll have other kids." Over the following weeks, stories of other babies, other deaths, other disappearances were circulated around the camp. Later, it became clear that many babies had gone missing the same way during those years, most of them Yemeni, the rest Mizrahi and Balkan, and even the odd Ashkenazi child. Some people, like Yosef Radai from the neighboring tent, didn't believe the nurses. He searched through the hospital in a blinding rage and found his girl undead. Rumors spread of wealthy American Jews coming to choose children to adopt, children who had been dressed for the occasion in clothes that weren't theirs, displayed like cattle. After all, Yemeni immigrant had many children, too many children, and no awareness of hygiene. They lacked parenting skills, and they were foreign looking. So unlike the European Jews, so easily othered, it seemed okay to take their children away from them, move them to a different location, or not keep track of them. I'll stop here.
Thank you. So before, when you described Zohara, whose point of view we hear here, you describe her as the protagonist, right?
Yeah.
The main character. But in fact, there are three voices that are central to the text. And we get a shift in perspective as we move from each chapter. We have Yakub, Zohara, and Yoni.
That's right.
But they're told in different forms, right? Zohara gets the first person, but Yakub and Yoni get the third person. So I was just wondering about the structure, what you thought about it. And again, this is the question of perspective, perhaps, and looking at events from different places.
I think it was important for me that Zohara's voice would be in first person, because this is, to me, a book about women, and it's a book about female voices. And she's also a much larger, portion of the book. And in a sense, Yoni and Yakub, who I love, as I said, I love them all. They're, characters that are very close to my heart. They're also, in a sense, supporting the character of Saida, who is it's not a spoiler, it's the grandmother or Zohara's mom, Yoni's grandmother, Zohara's mom, who dies at the beginning of the novel. Yemeni women where their voices weren't really heard much. It was a deeply traditional, patriarchal society, and they were told to be quiet. There's a quote in here that I love. The poet Bracha Seri, a Yemeni poet who was born in Yemen, who said that there was no greater insult for a Yemeni woman than to be considered unquiet. And I wanted to amplify the Yemeni women's voices. And the other thing too, because I grew up in to me it felt like my father was the quiet one, you know. It felt like such a matriarchal society. The women in my family, they're so loud and so, you know, opinionated, and I couldn't reconcile that, you know, that kind of oppression with how large they loomed in my life. And I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about the singing at this point,
yes,
because it feels like it's leading
absolutely.
to it. So in my research, because I was doing so much research about Yemeni culture and lives and everything, it wasn't even for a specific project. It was just, I knew that I wanted to know everything there is to know. And in one point, I kind of unlocked that story of the women's songs. And it was this repertoire of songs that were unwritten because the women were illiterate. And they were sung in Arabic because they didn't know Hebrew in Yemen. The men knew Hebrew because they prayed. And the women were not allowed to pray, and they didn't go to school, so they only spoke Yemeni Arabic. So their songs were in Arabic. And there were love songs, and there were songs of betrayal, and there were songs about, you know, the second wife. Polygamy was very common in Yemen. And it was about their heartaches and their you know, their loves and their losses. And the men also had a repertoire of songs, but their songs were devotional. You know, if you've ever heard of Shabazi, the Yemeni poet, songs like that, songs that like Imnin Alu of a Chaz's song, it's songs that are very devotional in nature. And once I discovered that treasure, my mind was blown. And suddenly I understood that this was how they communicated, and this was how they expressed themselves, and this was how they claimed their stories and their narrative and their voices. And I just fell in love with this tradition, and I started studying it and singing it and learning to sing it. And I think that's when I knew that it was going to become a really big part of this novel. And going back to Saida and her voice, because she's, you know, dead at the time, we have the stories of Zohara, and we have the stories of Yoni, and we have the stories of Yagub, but we also have her songs. And that was my way of kind of, again, having both that silence, because, you know, that was a big part and attribute of what it meant to be a Yemeni woman during that time, but also have her voice and her story and her narrative be told.
One, I should add that I think Bracha Seri has spent significant time here in Berkeley, California, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
Really?
yeah, pride to
Oh
us.
my God.
Yeah. But on another note, so I have two questions. Tell me which one
Okay.
you want to answer. One is about how to put oral voices in writing. And the second is about your voice and the shifting between Hebrew and English.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Go for it.
All right. That was actually an interesting, okay. Because it's connected, it's related, those two questions.
Okay, good.
So there are several layers of translations that happened in the writing of this book. Yes, the first one is that I'm writing in English, and I'm Hebrew is my native tongue. And not only that, but I'm also writing about people who are living in Hebrew. And people ask often if I think in Hebrew and I think in English. It's not that binary, it's not that simple. It's like you think both. You know, like sometimes people, it's, what do you dream in? I dream about, you know, Canadian people speaking Hebrew. I speak about Israeli people saying things in Hebrewish. Like, it's just, it's all mixed up. But a lot of the times in this writing of the book, for example, every time there was a dialogue, I was aware that the characters were speaking Hebrew. And I made a decision, a conscious decision, whether I am now translating or letting it be natural in English, with the thought that once it is translated into Hebrew, which I'm doing right now, by the way, it's terrifying, the whole, but I will change it. I already knew that as I was doing that. Now, where's the poems? Where's the songs? By taking an oral tradition and translating it onto the page, obviously something is compromised. That's, you know, it's the nature of this tradition, was that it was, you know, spoken and forwarded and passed on from mother to daughter, which is also, you know, relevant here. Yes, but also, how else would I celebrate it? How else would I, you know, like I wanted to be able to honor that tradition. But also, the songs were sung in Yemeni Arabic. I read them in the Hebrew translation. I understand Arabic a little bit, but when I was translating them, I translated from the Hebrew because it's just easier for me. So there's already an act of double translation there. Now, finally, and that's the coolest thing. So I'm sitting there and I'm translating them and I'm like, I don't know, something felt lackluster. And then I realized that the whole idea of the tradition, and maybe that was again a way for me to kind of reconcile and found a way around it. The whole idea of the tradition is that it's dynamic and it changes every time it's being told or sung. So I messed with it. So I changed it. So I kind of, you know, matched words, like a line from here and a line from there, and I added a whole line that is my own, you know, that is in Saida's spirit, obviously, because she's the poetess, not me. But that was so much fun to do, and it made me feel like a little bit like I'm a rightful successor and I belong in this tradition, even though it's in English and even though I'm committing it to paper. Because the world is changing, you know. But yeah, that was, something.
Can you give us can you hear me?
Something happened.
I'll give you this one.
It's because we're talking about song. Then.
Yeah, and voice.
Exactly. Can you give us an example of a moment in which it was hard to translate the Hebrew idiomatic form of dialogue into English?
Yeah, there's a, for example, just a point where someone asks, who's your friend? And she says, oh, do you mean Iggy? And she's like, no, the pregnant one. And someone actually just told me that recently. It's like, that could have never happened in Hebrew. I was like, I know, but I have that already figured out, you know? In my mind, she was asking her, who did I see you with downstairs, right? Like, I had it. I figured it out as I was writing it. Because obviously Hebrew is gendered, so you can't say who's your friend. It would be either chaver or chavera. So yeah, I always knew what I was doing and how it would translate back into Hebrew. Yeah.
When did you decide if that is a moment to write in English, or did you ever have second thoughts about writing this novel to begin with in Hebrew?
When did I decide to write in English?
Yes.
I
know,
didn't. I didn't decide. I did not decide.
It just happened.
Yeah. And it also wasn't a moment. It was something that was very gradual and took a long time. When I moved to Canada, I stopped writing altogether. I didn't even think about it. I didn't think that by moving to a country where English is spoken, I'm going to lose my only skill. I wasn't aware. And at first, I thought maybe I could still write in Hebrew. And I know people do it. My Arad lives here. But for me, first of all, Vancouver was had no Israelis at the time. Seriously, there were 5, I think. There were no Israelis. Wow. It changed a lot.
A lot.
Yeah, but there were none. So I never heard it on the street. I'm totally dating myself here. There was no social media, so there was no that kind of, direct connection or no WhatsApp. It was just, I was really living in English and I was not using Hebrew at all. For days I would not utter a Hebrew word. So that may have accelerated a little bit my sort of transition into English. But by accelerating, I mean years. It took years of not writing anything at all. Wow. And I was like, I have a writing block. It was not writing block. It was lingual confusion and fear. I always say that writer's block is just fear, and it was a justified fear. It's terrifying, So years passed, but English became more dominant and started to make itself known. And then, in my journal entries, sometimes I'd find myself writing a line in English. And then I met a guy. And we were together for about a year, and he said, for our anniversary, I want you to write me a story. Because he said to me, oh, you're one of those writers who never write? And I was like, who is this guy? And then I married him. So I wrote him a story. It was terrible. It was riddled with cliches and mistakes and errors, but I wrote him a story. And there was something about English that was exciting to me, the newness of it and the anonymity of it and the reinvention, which is very much like migration, really. Yeah.
I know we're almost nearing the Q&A, but I do want to add one last question. Yeah. That is more kind of peripheral in the story, but is really interesting to me, so I'm going to take advantage and say that Zohara is an academic, right? She's a literary scholar.
That's right.
Struggling to write her PhD.
Yeah.
So I was wondering why you put her in that position, and also you don't paint a very good picture of academia. So I was wondering if you don't have to answer.
No, it's okay. So I'm not an academic. When I talk about that fork in the road, mm-hmm. and I talk about my father's passing, I often have a feeling that if he was alive, maybe I would have been. His death kind of sent me in a very different direction. And there was also no money for school. So I ended up not going to university. And then I went to Canada, and then I took some student loans, but I just went to college. It was just it was not something that was easily accessible mm-hmm. to me in life. And it was always kind of that other life, that unlived mm-hmm. life for me. And then when I was 36, I actually finally went to university, but I skipped the BA part and I only did my master's. in creative writing. So I eventually did go to university, but it was kind of a different experience. But yeah, I've always felt like it was that life that I could have had and never did. So I think that's why. Again, it's very boring to only write what you know. And I write a lot of what I know, but I'm also interested in writing a little bit about what I don't. And I can't tell you how many academics I've interviewed. So many. Like I have I think I've thanked them all in the acknowledgements. You'll see like a list of PhD students and profs and
yeah. Okay, so I'll end with your quote about two kind of parallel lives.
Okay.
That I thought was really beautiful about Zohara living with the ghost of her previous possible self that remained in Israel rather than went to New York to study literature. Like two transparencies, one placed over the other, I could slide into the skin of that ghost Zohara who stayed, everything restored, the unlived life resurrected. There was no fixing this, no reclaiming, it was too late. So I skipped a paragraph, but I really thought that was beautiful.
That's funny.
Okay, so maybe we can open it up.
Yeah, and I'll pass the microphone so that people can ask their questions and be heard.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading the book. Taking off on the discussion we just had, I'm going to ask you a question, let's say as if you were an academic, even though you say you're not. But, if you think back 150 years ago or 100 years ago, when the Zionists were having this debate about what should the national language be.
Yeah.
And the idea that speaking Hebrew was going to be the core experience that would tie people together. I was in Israel a couple of years ago with a friend of mine who's Jewish American. She said, this is so irrational. Why doesn't everybody just convert to English and then get rid of this Hebrew and then they could be part of the modern world? So I guess my question for you is, how essential is Hebrew to Jewish identity?
Yeah.
And as someone who's not there, if you were put in charge of the decision, would you keep Hebrew as the national language?
Tiny question.
I immediately think, yes, of course. First of all, I do live there. I live in Israel. I've moved back 6 years ago. Yeah, I know. We've skipped that part. I am very attached to Hebrew. And I say that apologetically because I sometimes feel guilty about betraying it and falling in love with another. I realize it's an irrational thought.
Another language.
Yeah, but it's a thought that I've grappled with, and I've often felt like I have to sort of justify, that I still feel very, that it's my first love, and I love Hebrew. Hebrew is the language of my childhood. Hebrew is the language that I wrote my first stories and poems and read my favorite books. And for a very, very long time, it was my only language. So romantically, I love that idea, that they found that. Like, I remember someone said, like, oh, there was already a language like that, Yiddish. And I was like, no, there wasn't. We didn't speak Yiddish. My ancestors didn't speak Yiddish. So I love that, and also because I know, if we're going back to my ancestors, the men, at least, spoke Hebrew, cherished it. That was the holy tongue. It's an irrational, but I love that. I love the irrationality of it, it makes sense. And I sometimes think about my dad too, because when why do I think about my dad? Because some of I think my being apologetic about it is because I feel bad toward my father who loved Hebrew. And when I think about him, I know that he was a poet. And he also had kind of a secret language. When he was writing his poetry, his parents would not be reading it. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, exactly. Like his father knew it, yeah, but it was more of a modern Hebrew rather than like the archaic Hebrew that he came with from Yemen. So I feel like in that sense we can relate to this discovery of that new language that is a secret language to create in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for writing this book.
Yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you.
I just finished it a couple days ago. I'm not sure how to ask this, but there's so many instances or characters who are really appropriately pained by what you've had life deal them in this story, or in the stories, which is why I like the title "Songs of the Brokenhearted," because it's different characters put up with so much pain, but they also were so accepting. And so there's a silent kind of courage that develops in my mind as you took me through the stories. And I'm wondering, how did you conceive of the acceptance? Or is it more like, no, that's really what it's like. They're really that accepting.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were remarkably courageous and accepting.
First of all, I'm like when I hear that, the pain, I always want to say like, but there's hope too, right? And I think that's, like, I don't know if I thought of acceptance so much as I thought of hope. I think there is a resilience. I think that, we commonly speak about, we just said Ariel Sharon, like saying that resilience of the Jewish people, but I also think more smallly, the resilience of my people, my community, the resilience of the Yemeni community, and the resilience of the people I saw around me, the resilience of my mother, and my grandmother. So even more specifically, the women, right? So I think that was my inspiration. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wonder if I can slip in 2 questions as well. I wonder how writing a novel versus a memoir differed for you, because I had to keep reminding myself as I delved into the book that this wasn't a memoir.
Yeah.
It felt like it particularly sort of was so hard a story dealing with her mother. It felt so real. So I wondered your thoughts about sort of what that was like as a writer to sort of explore those. And I guess the other question I really am curious about is with Zohara, the ambivalence that you capture between sort of being between cultures, sort of her ambivalence towards her Yemenite culture, sort of her rejection of it as a child, her sort of coming to terms with what she's rejected and the choices she's made, but there's a kind of ambivalence there. And I wondered how you captured that.
Yeah. When I finished with my memoir, I kept saying that I can't wait to write fiction because I'm sick of me. And it's funny because now I'm like, I think I want to write essays. Like after I did the fiction thing. But obviously, as fiction writers, we borrow from life. And I relate to Zohara in so many ways, so strongly. And there's so many elements of her life and her character that are, real and close to my own. And yet there are many that aren't, and I think that's why I love fiction. I love that. I love imagining. I love, I think people often think that all fiction is like thinly veiled. But I'm like, I wrote a memoir. I'm okay with like not thinly veiled. You know, like I can tell the story. And when I write novels, I do like to you know, להפליג על כנפי הדמיון, אני רוצה להגיד. To just kind of
Soar in the wings of the
soar on the wings of imagination. I enjoy that. That's a big part of. And I remember thinking during the time that I was writing it, that I don't know how people live without this extra imaginary world in their heads. I'm like, I'm so lucky, you know, that I get to spend time with all these characters, and you know, all this stuff is happening in that other world, you know. As far as the ambivalence, this is something that, of course, it's not, you know, exactly as Zohara's experience, but I think it's actually an experience that is common to many Israelis. Zohara is older than me. It's a different generation too, a little bit. It's maybe my older siblings or something like that. But the whole idea of Israel was that you kind of had to leave your background behind, you know, with that language thing that we talked about, and be, you know, Israeli. And of course, more so with the Mizrahi, because they represented something that was, you know, that it was too much like the place, too much like the Middle East. And these are things that have been said, you know, like point blank by leaders at the time. You know, we need to cure them of their Arabness. These are things that we're told. So that ambivalence comes from there. You know, it's not simply just Zohara, and some of it is. All, you know, teenagers, I think, at some point want to distance themselves from their parents. But a lot of it was, you know, wanting to belong, wanting to be a part of this place and be Israeli, and reject those diasporic, Arabic-sounding parents. You know, it's a very sadly common story. Yeah.
I have a question about your writing process, whether you have figured out where the story is going to go before you sit down and put it together. Did you get yourself embedded in this, or do you sort of, like, does it tell itself as you go along in the process, as the characters speak to you? And then how, when you're in the midst of writing, how do you then step away and like go back to your regular life? And then also, just as an aside, you have a child, so do you tell and make up imaginary stories for your child?
I used to when she was smaller, for sure. It was, yeah. But now she tells her own imaginative stories. She's like started writing. It's terrifying. And she does it in both languages. She sits there on the computer. Here, can I read you? Can I read you? I'm like, you don't have to read every paragraph. Can you finish a page first? But yeah, she's really into it. What I ended up doing, and I'm, okay, because there's two, those of you who write or know writers, there's two main kind of writers, the ones who outline everything, and the ones who just kind of go by the light of their pants, something, there's a seat of their pants. I'm notorious for murdering English expressions. So what I ended up doing, and I think someone once recommended this, or I don't remember where I heard it, but it really works for me, is that I kind of have spots, I kind of know where it's going, and I have spots, like anchors in the narrative. I don't entirely, I know kind of how it's going to end, but not 100% sure. And why? Because you need magic. And if you're too outlined, you're boxed yourself in, and you're not allowing surprises. You're not allowing the characters to surprise you. And there's no room for mystery, which is a big part of the process. Like, you know, it's a creative process. It's not academic writing, right?
That is magical too.
So I write toward those spots in the narrative. And as I write toward that spot, a lot of things can go wild, right? And then I reach that spot, and then I write toward the next spot. So that's kind of an in-between those two methods, if that makes sense.
Hello.
Hey.
My name is Diller, and I'm from Saudi Arabia. I heard about this event from an Israeli friend, so I thought it would be very interesting to come and attend. I always find it interesting to learn about the stories and ideas of Israelis who come from an Arab or Arabic origins.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming, and thank you for writing this very interesting book. I would highly recommend.
Oh, thank you.
Translate it to Arabic.
Let's do it.
Many people in the world will find it very interesting. I wanted to ask how is your relationship with the Arab world, with Yemen, with Arabic coffee?
Yeah.
With the different concepts and feelings that come in the Arab world.
Yeah.
And hear more about how do you feel about that, how is your relationship? And thank you very much for this amazing.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Okay, so there's a couple things. I'll talk about Yemen in a minute. But first, one of the things that happened when I moved to Canada is that, like I mentioned, there were no Israelis in the city where I was living at the time. And in my sort of search for belonging and for some semblance of a home, I found myself in the Arabic community. I started working at a Lebanese restaurant, and I worked there for 6 years. When I was talking about the unlived life and how I could have been an academic, instead of an academic, I was a waitress for many, many years, and I was very good at it. So I worked at a Lebanese restaurant, and I found that actually sort of strengthened my longing for home and for my Yemeni identity. Every time I came home, I wanted to spend more time with my grandmother and ask her questions and try to, learn the language more and just immerse myself. So it was kind of a journey from pushing away and rejecting, my background to wanting to embrace it. So that's the first thing, that's kind of I found my Yemeniness through that Arabness in Vancouver. Specifically about Yemen, I used to think that I will visit it one day, and I really wanted to. That was before the war, and I knew people. I have a family, through marriage, a photographer that went back in '91 and took some amazing photos of the Jewish people that still lived there at the time. Unfortunately, now there's none. A couple of years ago, they were all kicked out, so it's an end of an era. It's very, very sad. I always wanted to go, and I'm really sad that right now it's not looking in the cards. Every now and then I get messages from there. Just recently I got a woman wrote to me. She read an essay that I wrote about the women's songs that was published in Lit Hub. And she wrote in Arabic, and she said, I know you're learning Arabic, maybe you can understand some of it. I started, and I was like, I gave up and put it in Google Translate. And that was really moving. So I wish that I could explore that further. I'm really envious of people that can go back to places where their families lived for generations, and We talked about that, Julie, about you going to India, and you know, I really wish that I could. Yeah, and my memoir was supposed to be translated into Arabic, by the way. I already signed a contract and everything, and I was thrilled. And unfortunately, they were based in Egypt, and then there was some big drama, and they were put on trial. Something bad happened, and they folded, and it never happened. Yeah, but so yeah, let's translate this novel. If you have connections, let me know.
Hi. So I've read some of your writing besides this book, and the article that you wrote about coming back to Israel with your family. And I'm curious, you just talked about wanting to go back to Yemen and not being able to, but you were able to bring your daughter back to your home,
Yeah.
right, in Israel.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what your experience was seeing Israel through her eyes, as like someone who was raised in Canada, and
Yeah.
if that shaped your perception of like what it would look like to go back to Yemen, and like introducing your identity from that time to your daughter.
You just reminded me of a really funny thing she said when she first arrived. She said, Israel is famous for sunshine and cats. She was 5. That was a very astute observation. It's a little bit different because she spent, she was 5 when she moved to Israel, but she spent so much time in Israel. We used to go there every year for a couple months. So she spoke the language. She knew things, it wasn't entirely foreign to her. So yeah, I don't know if I quite see the parallels there. And for me too, it's like, in the book, we're talking about a family that came in 48. My family actually came much longer before that. My grandparents came in 34.
Wow.
And in fact, my great-grandmother came in 1905. It's a strange story where she abandoned my grandmother in Yemen and came before. So we have actually a very long history in Israel Palestine, in Ottoman Empire times. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Are you raising your hand?
No, she's just.
Other questions?
Do you use for either inspiration or technical guidance any other cross-generational novels that would kind of like follow a family tree, so to speak?
Every time I'm asked about other books, I'm like, I completely draw blankets. Just not really a family saga kind of thing, but recently someone asked me for a book inspiration for a podcast that I was on, and I mentioned The God of Small Things. And it's not so much a family saga, but it's about like writing about such a complex political landscape, and also about place and about the attention to place. And also it was the first book that I read in English when I was like 24. So that's a book that came to mind. I love family sagas, but now I have nothing. I'm like, I can't remember any.
Well, now yours is.
There you go. Thank you.
You talked a little bit about your writing process earlier, and I was wondering, just on a day-to-day basis, if there's any like practices or things that you do that you feel like fuel creativity or have been really important for you in your creative life?
Yeah. It's very different every time, and I think it's really important for writers to not put those kind of expectations of write every day and write that many hours. It's such bullshit. It's just, no, it sets us up for failure. And a lot of people have, you have small children and you have full-time jobs, and it's just not realistic, and it makes me angry. But so it's always different for me. But I can say that when I was really devoted to this, like I've written it for a while, like kind of in between doing other things, and then at some point I was like, okay, I got to do this. I really got to commit, and I was lucky and privileged to get a grant from the government of Canada that gave me some money, and I told my place of work that I'm going to take some time off, right? And then I woke up at 5. And I did that because I also have a child, and I needed to get those 2 hours in the morning before she gets up. And those were the best 2 hours. They were the best. It was amazing. I can't, I'm sorry. I know it's terrible. Nobody wants to wake up at 5. I don't want to wake up at 5. I don't like it. It's not like my thing. But for finishing that draft, it was essential. And I still do it sometimes. Like right now when I'm translating, I'm like, I think you have to wake up at 5 again. I don't want to, but I think I need to. Yeah, and I try to write at least until like lunchtime or something. And then I usually go exercise or walk and stuff like that. And then I come back. If I can still write, I will, but sometimes I can't. Sometimes I'll do other things. Sometimes I'll edit. And also another thing that's really important for me is some people may be able to just focus on one thing. I kind of need to do other things sometimes. So sometimes like maybe write something else. I'll write a haiku or write an essay or, you know what I mean? Just like, I like to have more than one thing on the go. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and one more thing I want to say. Walking is really, really, really important, and keeping a notebook with you. And sometimes I do this mad thing where I'd write while walking.
Mary Oliver used to do that.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know
She
that.
walked through the woods and with her notepad. Most of her poems were written standing up.
No, I had no idea. And
See?
sometimes I would do it for a specific sentence that was driving me crazy. I'm like, I'm taking this sentence for a walk. I'm like, it needs to get out of the computer, it needs to get on paper, and it needs to move. And that's how I kind of solve the sentence. Yeah.
And thank you for the talk. And I was going to ask you about your immigration experience. You were talking about how there's not many Israelis in Canada, and you found a community in Arabic-speaking places.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of Jews in Canada, and I'm curious about your experience with maybe the overwhelmingly Ashkenazi Jewish community in Canada.
Yeah, I kind of skipped that part. You're right. So what happened when I came to Canada? Like I said, there were no Israelis, and in my search for some community, I did go to the JCC, and I just didn't find it. It was very Ashkenazi and it was very Canadian, and I just came, I was like, if there were Israelis there, I'd probably feel differently. I didn't feel it at the time. I appreciate, the Jewish community in North America, and they've been such great supporters of my work. But for a 25-year-old, young woman who was seeking some sort of a community, I didn't find it there. Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask one other question. I know you talked a little bit about this, but I'd love to hear more how you decided on the characters you would focus on Yaakov Yakub on Yoni and on Zohar, and also choosing Zohar in the first person, others in the third. Like, I know the grandmother speaks through her songs, but the choice of Yakub to tell that time period of the 1950s rather than her. I'm just what you might say.
So Zohara was always clear to me. She was the first. She was the main voice, and she came easily to me, and she was first person. Always. And in the earlier iterations of the book, when I was thinking I was going to write more about the missing children, I had, Saida's chapters written in a third person though. And I don't know, I said before that a lot of it is that there's a mystery to it. It's not like, we want to assign some,
logic.
What did you say?
Logic.
Yeah, some logic to some of those creative choices, but sometimes it's just what the writing, but what the story demands, and it's just like you're kind of its servant really, and you're doing what it tells you to do, So I knew that Zohar was first person, and then with the Yakub was just a way for me to kind of access Saida's story, And Yoni was the last one, and Yoni was a surprise. Like I said, I didn't know where he came from. And it kind of terrified me a little bit. And that's why I knew that he had to be a part of it. I knew I wanted another generation there, but he really just showed up.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to ask the last question?
Yeah, I'm going to say one more comment that is kind of funny about magic and conversation, to go back to Matt's question, because I was reading the book and I told myself, I know it is the family saga that she's building on. Like, this is clearly based on the biblical story of Jacob. You know, they meet by the well and they fell in love, and he's called Yakub, and there are two wives, and one is fertile, non-fertile, and the other is loved, and like, and I'm like, I've got it solved completely. And then I spoke to Ayelet. She's like, what? I have no idea what you're talking about.
I deny. It was completely intentional.
I really think that.
There you go.
Yeah. There's a magic in the work of art, It speaks for itself. It has a voice.
That's right. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.